Most of us operate under the assumption that there is a comfortable distance between our daily lives and the more disturbing corners of the world. We rely on a psychological buffer that keeps the monsters of the world tucked away in distant cities or dark alleys. But the first level of intrusion often happens in plain sight. It starts when the public routines we take for granted, the ones we perform in broad daylight, are suddenly hijacked. Consider a young kid standing alone at a bus stop on a perfectly normal morning. A school bus pulled up to the curb, but the rows of seats behind the glass were completely empty. The driver smiled and told the kid to hop on. When the child asked where the other students were, the driver ignored the question, insisting they would go get them next. His demands grew increasingly pushy, but the child, guided by a sudden knot of unease, kept saying no until the driver finally gave up and drove away. Minutes later, the real bus arrived. When a threat hides inside a mundane public service, a sudden, instinctual refusal to follow the routine is often the only barrier left. That split-second decision to stay on the curb can be the difference between a normal day and a disappearance. That vulnerability only grows when you remove the daylight and isolate the target. Picture a tiny 8-by-8-foot security shack at a deserted campground, sitting alone in the dark during the graveyard shift. A few feet from that shack sat an old payphone. Every single morning, precisely at 4:17 a.m., that phone would ring exactly once. The tone was muffled and distorted, sounding like the receiver was submerged in water. After months of hearing it, the guard finally picked up the phone. There was no background noise, just dead air, followed by the wet sound of someone inhaling through clenched teeth. Then a rough voice that sounded like it had gargled gravel spoke the guard's exact first, middle, and last name. The guard slammed the phone down and dialed *69 to trace the call. The automated system read back a number originating from California. The guard was standing in a shack in Indiana. A public threat relies on an information imbalance. The predator can track a victim across a continent, holding all the cards, while the target stands completely exposed in the dark, wondering who is watching. The horror shifts into a new phase when a threat crosses the physical boundary of your personal property. The danger moves from a public space into the very objects you own for protection. A night shift worker was sitting alone in an office building located in a desolate industrial district. At 11:30 p.m., the silence broke with a massive crash as someone hurled a sizable rock straight through the front window. Panicking, the worker ran out of the building, sprinted to his car, and drove off. It wasn't until he was almost home that he realized he hadn't actually unlocked his car to get in. Someone had already been there. Still shaken, he decided to ride his bicycle over to a friend's house. As he pedaled down a quiet, moonlit road, he heard the hum of tires on the pavement behind him. He pulled to the side, and a silent figure slowly matched his pace. The stranger turned his head and shot him a wide, unhinged smile. It was terrifying on its own, but then the worker glanced down and realized the man was riding his mother's bicycle. The stalker had been to his home. A perimeter breach turns your own tools against you. When your car door is left open and your family's property is being ridden right next to you, the physical things you rely on for security become active instruments of terror. Sometimes this breach happens so quietly you don't even realize you've been targeted. Picture sitting in a loud, crowded bar listening to live music, only to reach into your pocket and find your phone is gone. After a search turns up nothing, you borrow a friend's phone to dial your number. It rings twice. Someone answers, lets out a low, raspy giggle, and immediately hangs up. Giving it up as a lost cause, you eventually head home for the night, only to walk into your bedroom and see your phone sitting perfectly undisturbed on your nightstand, right where you left it. A breach that occurs without a confrontation leaves the mind in a cycle of hyper-paranoia. You aren't just worried about a thief, you're forced to reconcile with the fact that someone walked through your sanctuary and left without you ever knowing they were there. The final phase of intrusion occurs when the walls of your own home are no longer enough to keep the outside world away. A man rented a newly renovated, highly secure apartment from a friend. The complex was pristine, but he soon discovered he was living next to a woman who spent her nights blasting Christian radio and screaming at empty rooms. When he finally knocked on her door to ask for quiet, he got a brief glimpse inside. The windows were painted black. 50-year-old stained carpets were crawling with cockroaches, and the walls were covered in painted crosses and religious phrases scrawled in different colors. Her behavior grew increasingly bizarre. She would stand beneath his bedroom window early in the morning, speaking aggressively in tongues. In the sweltering summer heat, she began carrying a plastic bag containing a rotting, dead dog. Pure, violent instability, living on the other side of a shared wall, erodes the very idea of a home as a sanctuary. The boundary that is supposed to keep you safe becomes a thin, fragile layer of drywall between you and someone who no longer follows any rules. The situation peaked when the man's girlfriend stayed over. He woke up in the middle of the night, and as his eyes adjusted to the dark, he realized he was not alone. The silhouette of a person was standing motionless right next to the bed, watching them sleep. He thought he was dreaming until the shadow spoke. It was the neighbor. She was holding a heavy object in her hand, and after breaking into a locked apartment and standing there in silence, she whispered, "You should lock your doors at night." Then she simply walked out. The true context of that moment arrived the next day. The woman had broken into another tenant's apartment, standing behind his couch while he watched TV with his kids. The heavy object she was carrying into people's bedrooms was a power drill. Because she legally owned her unit, the police had to wait for her to leave. The man watched her door for 2 straight days. When she finally stepped outside at 2 in the morning, police arrived with a special van and took her to an institution, removing her from the building in less than a minute. We lock our doors and reinforce our perimeters every single night to keep the outside world at bay. But the peak of terror is waking up in the dark and realizing the monster was already standing inside the house.